You know, I was really here a few years ago because of St. Luke's, and I had such a wonderful time. And I was trying to think of when would I have the opportunity to get back, and suddenly this manifested, so I'm very happy. Although it seemed a little strange to have snow the other day. Exactly, exactly. How many of you might have read my book? Hopefully you enjoyed it. What I'm going to talk to you about is my own path to compassion. And actually, many of us, today where we're at is a manifestation of where we've been. And that is no less the case with my own journey. I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke. She was paralyzed, chronically depressed, had attempted suicide multiple times. Neither had graduated from college. And we were on public assistance actually my entire life growing up. And I will share with you that the likelihood of you escaping that type of a background is very, very small. But what happened to me shows the power of what one person can do to change another person's life. And that's what I want to share a little bit with you. And also intertwine that with some neuroscience and contemplative practice. Before I do that, though, what I'd like to do is read the first opening chapter of my book. Now, I'll tell you, though, that I've done this once or twice, and once or twice people have fainted. But I'm not trying to prep you for that happen. But I think this chapter will give you a sense of where we're going to go with my talk. And so let me start there, and then we'll go from there. And this chapter is called Beautiful Things. There's a certain sound the scalp makes when it's being ripped off of the skull, like a large piece of Velcro tearing away from its source. The sound is loud and angry and just a little bit sad. In medical school, they don't have a class that teaches you the sounds and smells of brain surgery. They should. The drone of the heavy drill as it bores through the skull, the bone saw that fills the operating room with the smell of summer sawdust as it carves a line connecting the burr holes from the drill. The reluctant popping sound the skull makes as it is lifted away from the dura, the thick sac that covers the brain and serves as its last line of defense against the outside world. The scissors slicing through the dura. When the brain is exposed, you can see it move in rhythm with every heartbeat. And sometimes it seems that you can hear it moan in protest at its own nakedness and vulnerability. Its secrets exposed for all to see through the harsh lights of the operating room. The boy looks small in the hospital gown and is almost swallowed up by the bed as he's waiting to enter surgery. My Nana prayed for me, and she prayed for you. I hear the boy's mother inhale and exhale loudly at this information. And I know she's trying to be brave for her son, for herself, maybe even for me. I run my hand through his hair. It is brown and long and fine. Still more baby than boy. He tells me he just had a birthday. Do you want me to explain again what we're going to do today, champ? Or are you ready? He likes it when I call him champ or buddy. Drop. I'm going to sleep, he said. You're going to take the ugly thing out of my head so it doesn't hurt anymore. Then I see Mom and Nana. The ugly thing is medulloblastoma, the most common malignant brain tumor in children, and it's located in the posterior fossa at the base of the skull. Medulloblastoma isn't an easy word for an adult to pronounce, much less a 4-year-old, no matter how precocious. Medulloblastomas are misshapen and often grotesque invaders in the exquisite symmetry of the brain. They begin between the 2 lobes of the cerebellum and grow, ultimately compressing not only the cerebellum, but also the brainstem, until finally blocking the pathways that allow the fluid in the brain to circulate. The brain is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. And to explore its mysteries and find ways to heal it is a privilege I have never taken for granted. You sound ready to meet, champ. I'm going to put on my superhero mask and I'll meet you in the bright room, I tell him. He smiles up at me. Surgical masks and operating rooms can be scary. Today I will call them superhero masks and bright rooms so he won't be afraid. The mind is a funny thing, but I'm not about to explain semantics to a 4-year-old. Some of the wisest patients and people I have ever met have been children. The heart of a child is wide open. Children will tell you what scares them, what makes them happy, what they like about you, and what they don't. There is no hidden agenda, and you never have to guess how they really feel. I turn to his mother and grandmother. Someone from the team will update you as we progress. I anticipate it will be a complete reception. I don't expect any complications. This isn't just surgeon speak to tell them what they want to hear. My plan is for a clean and efficient surgery to remove the entire tumor while sending a small slice to the lab to just see how ugly this ugly thing is. I know both Mom and Grandma are scared. I hold each of their hands in turn, trying to reassure them and offer comfort. It's never easy. A little boy's morning headache has become a parent's worst nightmare. Mom trusts me. Grandma trusts God. I trust my team. Together, we will all try to save this boy's life. After the anesthesiologist counts him down to sleep, I place the boy's head in a frame attached to his skull and then position him prone. I get out the hair clippers. Although the nurse usually preps the surgery site, I prefer to shave the head myself. It's a ritual that I do. And as I slowly shave the head, I think of this precious little boy and go over every detail of his surgery in my mind. I cut off the first bit of hair and hand it to the circulator to put in a small bag for the boy's mother. This is his first haircut. And while it's the last thing on his mom's mind, I know it will matter to her later. It is a milestone you want to remember. First haircut, first tooth lost, first day of school, first time riding a bike. First brain surgery is never on this list. I gently cut away the fine light brown strands, hoping my young patient is able to experience each of these firsts. In my mind, I see him smiling with a large gap where his front teeth should be. I see him walking into kindergarten with a backpack that's almost as big as he is, slung over one shoulder. I see him riding a bike for the first time, the first thrill of freedom, pedaling feverishly with the wind in his hair. I think of my own children as I continue to clip his hair. The images and scenes of all of his firsts are so clear in my mind that I can't imagine any other outcome. I don't want to see a future of hospital visits and cancer treatments and additional surgeries. As a survivor of childhood brain tumor, he will always have to be monitored. But I refuse to see him in the future as he's been in the past. The nausea and vomiting, the falling down, the waking in the early morning hours, screaming for his mother because the ugly thing is compressing his brain and it hurts. There's enough heartbreak in life without adding this to the mix. I continue to gently clip his hair just enough so I can do my work. I make 2 dots at the base of his skull where I will make my incision and draw a straight line. Brain surgery is difficult, but surgery in the posterior fossa is even more so, and in a small child, excruciatingly difficult. The tumor is large and the work painstakingly slow and precise. Eyes looking through a microscope for hours focused on one thing. As surgeons, we are trained to shut down our own bodily responses as we operate. We don't take bathroom breaks, we don't eat. We have been trained to ignore when our backs ache and our muscles cramp. I remember the first time I was in the operating room assisting a very famous surgeon who was known not only for being brilliant, but for also being a belligerent and arrogant prima donna when he operated. I was intimidated and nervous as I stood next to him in the operating room. Sweat began pouring down my face, and I was breathing heavily into my mask, and my eyeglasses began steaming up. I couldn't see the instruments or even the operating field. I had worked so hard, overcome so much, and now here I was, doing surgery just like I had always imagined, but I couldn't see a thing. Then the unthinkable happened. A large drop of sweat rolled off of my face and into the sterile field. He went ballistic. It should have been the highlight of my life. My first time in surgery. But instead, I contaminated the surgical field and was summarily kicked out of the operating room. I have never forgotten that experience. Today, my forehead is cool and my eyesight clear. My pulse is slow and steady. Experience makes a difference. And in my operating room, I am not the dictator or a belligerent prima donna. Every member of the team is valuable and necessary. Everyone is focused on his or her part. The anesthesiologist monitors the blood pressure and oxygen, his level of consciousness, and the rhythm of his beating heart. The surgical nurse constantly monitors the instruments and supplies, making sure whatever I need is within reach. A large bag is attached to the drapes, and slowly I begin my work. The bag is collecting blood and irrigation fluid, and it's attached to a tube connected to a large suction machine that constantly measures the fluid, so we know exactly how much blood loss we have at any given moment. The surgeon assisting me is a senior resident in training. He's new to the team, but he's just as focused on the blood vessels and the brain tissue and the minutiae of removing this tumor as I am. We can't think about our plans for the next day, or hospital politics, or our children, or our relationship troubles at home. It's a form of hypervigilance, a single-pointed concentration, like meditation. We train the mind, and the mind trains the body. There is an amazing rhythm and flow when you have a good team. Everyone is in sync. Our minds and bodies work together as one coordinated intelligence. I am now removing the last piece of tumor from this precious child's brain. It's attached to one of the major draining veins in the brain. The posterior fossa venous system is incredibly complex, and my assistant is suctioning fluids as I carefully resect the final remnant of the tumor. For 1 second, he lets his attention wander. And in that second, his suction tears the vein. And for the briefest moment, everything stops. And then all hell breaks loose. The blood from the ripped vein fills the resection cavity, and blood begins to pour out of the wound. This beautiful little boy's head. The anesthesiologist starts yelling that the child's blood pressure is rapidly dropping, and he can't keep up with the blood loss. I need to clamp the vein and stop the bleeding, but it's retracted into a pool of blood, and I can't see it. My suction alone can't control the bleeding, and my assistant's hand is shaking too much to be of help. The anesthesiologist screams. He's in full arrest. He now scrambles under the table because the little boy's head is locked in a head frame, prone, and with the back of his head opened up. The anesthesiologist starts compressing the boy's chest while holding his other hand on his back, trying desperately to get his heart to start pumping. Fluids are being poured into the large IV lines. The heart's first and most important job is to pump blood. And this magical pump that makes everything in the body possible has stopped. This 4-year-old is bleeding to death on the table in front of me. As the anesthesiologist pumps on his chest, the wound continues to fill with blood. We have to stop the bleeding, or he will die. The brain consumes 15% of the outflow of the heart and can survive only minutes after the heart stops. It needs blood, and more importantly, the oxygen in the blood. We are running out of time before the brain dies. They need each other, the brain and the heart. I'm frantically trying to clamp the vein, but there's no way to see the vessel through all of the blood. Although his head is in a fixed position, the chest compressions are moving it ever so slightly. The team knows, and I know, we are running out of time. The anesthesiologist looks up at me. I can see the fear in his eyes. We might lose this child. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation is like trying to clutch start a car in second gear. It's not very reliable, especially in the face of us losing more blood. The blood continues to overflow from this opening in this child's head, and I am working blind. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. I look at the heart monitor, and there's still no heartbeat. At that moment, I open my heart to a possibility beyond reason, beyond skill. And I do what I was taught decades ago, not in residency, not in medical school, but in the back room of a small magic shop in the California desert. I calm my mind, I relax my body, I visualize the retracted vessel, and I see it in my mind's eye, folded into this young boy's neurovascular highway. I reach in blindly, but knowing that there is more to this life than we can possibly see, and that each of us is capable of doing amazing things far beyond what we think is possible. We control our fates, and I don't accept that this 4-year-old is destined to die today on the operating table. I reach down into the pool of blood with the open clip and close it and slowly pull my hand away. The bleeding stops. And then, as if far away, I hear the slow blip of the heart monitor. It's faint at first, uneven, but soon it gets stronger and steadier, as all hearts do when they begin to come to life. I feel my own heartbeat begin to match the rhythm on the monitor. Later, in post-op, I will give his mother the remnants from his first haircut, and my little buddy will come out of anesthesia a survivor. He will be completely normal. In 48 hours, he will be talking and even laughing. And I will be able to tell him that the ugly thing is gone. Actually, there is a patient of mine here who just by coincidence is here. Well, maybe not by coincidence, in the sense that I guess the family heard I was speaking and they came. And is Gus Griffith, there you are, young. Can you stand up for me? Yeah. So can I tell them a little bit about him? Okay. So, if I recall correctly, she had a ruptured aneurysm, and actually it was a very, very difficult problem, and she was actually going to die, and I ended up operating on her, and she had actually a very difficult course, but she also was a fighter, and her family was there for her, and she's with us today with her family. So you might wonder how a guy with my background actually ended up being here. And I have to tell you that by the age of 12, I was already angry. I felt a sense of hopelessness. I felt a sense of despair. Because when you grow up in the environment I described, you don't have mentors available to you. You don't have access. You don't have money. You don't have tutors. You don't even have guidance. In fact, my day, I didn't have to go to school if I didn't want to. I didn't even know that you were supposed to study. But what I did know was that I was unhappy. And when you're unhappy and you don't have a future, you translate that unhappiness, that anger, actually in a negative way oftentimes, and I was becoming a juvenile delinquent. And certainly that didn't make me happy, but it took me away from my own pain. And the problem is oftentimes when we're in these circumstances, when events are occurring and they're negative events, we translate and there must be something wrong with us. And that's why this is happening to us. And I think this is even more so as a child. And what happened to me though at the age of 12 was that I walked into a magic shop. And I had an interest in magic. And I walked into the shop, and it was quite a ways from where I usually went on my bicycle. And I walked in, and there was this woman at the counter. And she had these glasses on with the chain on them. I know. You only start wearing that after the age of 50. I have a set. But she was there reading actually a paperback book. And she looked up from her reading and she smiled at me. And how many of you have met people who, as soon as you have eye contact with them, you feel this sense of calmness, this radiance about them, this joy about them? And she had that. And as soon as I saw her, I completely relaxed and felt that I could trust her. And from an environment like my own, you don't have a lot of trust. Because from second to second, you never know what's going to happen. I wouldn't know if my father was not going to come home, if he was going to be arrested, or if my mother was going to attempt suicide. So when you have that floating in the back of your mind, it's incredibly, incredibly stressful. And in some ways now we know that children in these environments, it's a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a whole field of that's evolving called adolescent childhood or adverse childhood experiences. And it has a profound, profound effect on health and your ability to attend and your ability to succeed in life. But I walked in and I asked this woman a question, and she said, "I don't know anything about magic." And she said, "This is my son's store, and he went to run an errand, and I'm just here minding the shop." So she started, though, asking questions about me. Now, the reality with many of us is that if you meet a stranger, you don't tell them really about you. You tell them a little bit about you. And what's the bit you tell them? It's the bit you like about yourself, or the bit you want to project to them about you have your act together and you're doing well and life is great and everything, right? You don't tell them that you're suffering, that you may have a spouse who has an addiction disorder or a loved one with cancer, because you're afraid. You're afraid of being judged. And people make opinions about you. But for this woman, she actually asked me about my background, and I told her, which I frankly would never tell anyone because I was ashamed. So I told her, we began talking. And she continued to just have this incredible presence about her. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, she said to me, "You know, I really like you." She said, "I'm here for another 6 weeks. If you show up, I'll teach you something that could change your life." Now, that's sort of interesting, right? A woman in a magic shop. I mean, I don't tell that to people, right? But she said that to me, and I stopped, and she said, "Yes, come here every morning." And amazingly, I did. And I wish I could tell you it was because I had this incredible insight. But it was because she had Chips Ahoy cookies. And I had nothing else to do. You know, it's funny, somebody read this book, and I get this box of Chips Ahoy cookies because I mentioned that. So that's why I gained a few pounds. But I did come back every day for 6 weeks. And nowadays, if a woman in her 50s took a 12-year-old in the back of a room, but perhaps it was a more innocent time then. But what I talk about in the book, and I think what many of our wonderful speakers have been talking about, is to develop an understanding of who you are and how you react to the world, and to give you some insights into how you can act and respond to the world in a way that allows you to be your best self. And that's a challenge for all of us. And what this woman taught me over this period of time was what I call for tricks. And this woman's name was Ruth. And so what I didn't appreciate at that time was that, and Ariana alluded to this, as have other speakers, you know, your life situation, the modern world, we are not often prepared for what that entails, or have the tools to respond to that. And I certainly didn't. And what I didn't realize then, and what she taught me how to respond to, was I was completely tense all the time. Because I didn't know what was going to happen. I was in survival mode. I was in threat mode. I was always afraid. Because I so wanted to control my environment. I so wanted to know that from now, let's say in the morning to the evening, everything was going to be okay. But I never had that. And she recognized this, and the first thing that she taught me was how to relax the body. And for weeks, and I have to tell you, as a 12-year-old, when I first started this, it was really hard. And in fact, the only reason I came back was the cookies. But what I found was that she taught me a breathing technique. She taught me a technique to be able to focus and to relax and to be with that stress and anxiety and then to let it go. And I was able to sit and relax, frankly, for the first time, in as long as I could remember, because I was always fidgety, waiting for something to happen. And the other challenge for so many of us, and this gets back to being present, is that we have so many things on our mind all the time. We're the most evolved species who's able to do what? We have a remembrance of a past and an understanding of a future. And what happens is that many of us are sitting there, I should have, I could have, I might have, what if? And then if you're not doing that, you're saying, what do I have to do tomorrow? What do I need to do? I have to get this done. And what happens is that you're not here. Yet, as a species, being here is actually what makes life worthwhile. And in fact, and I'll tell you about some science, being present is when your physiology works its best. Being in those other places creates stress and anxiety. And so what she taught me was how to be present and to relax. And you cannot accomplish tasks if you're always distracted. There have been studies that have shown that almost 80% of the time, people are not present. Your mind is elsewhere. I'm sure there are a number of people in this room thinking about the next thing they're going to go to, who they're having dinner with, the argument they had with their spouse this morning. None of that's happened to any of you, though. And that is the situation for many people. So the first lesson, and that was the hardest to put me in the right frame of mind, was that. And the second thing that she taught me is that, and David White, who was just extraordinary, I was listening to him, and he really reinforced this, but he said, if I can recall, he said, I'm so critical of myself that I would never be that critical to another person, and if I was that critical to another person, I would never want them to be my friend. And this is the problem, right? I mean, so many of us beat ourselves up. We don't think we're good enough. And Agape was talking about this. We're not skinny enough. We're not smart enough. And the problem is that this narrative that you carry creates a prison for you. Because what happens is that once you say, I'm not good enough, once you say, I'm not able to do that, by definition, you cannot. and you have created a prison for which you no longer have the key. And that's what's happened to so many of us. Is we listen to this narrative, and where does this narrative come from? How many of you have quote-unquote friends who you get an idea and you're so excited about the idea, and you go to them and you go, you know, I want to do this. And they look and they go, that's the stupidest idea. Right? I mean, so many people, you express a desire, a wish, a dream, and they tell you it's not possible. And do you know why they tell you that? Because they're scared and it's not possible for them. And they don't want it to be possible for you. And it's not because they're being mean, they don't even understand it. And what happens after years and years of these types of experiences, or experiences where you have listened to a narrative that's not one of positivity, you have this ongoing narrative that tells you you're not good enough. And I had this. You know, I wasn't smart enough. I didn't know this, I didn't know that. I did certain things and I failed at them. And each one of those was another stone, another brick in building that prison, where I no longer saw a world of opportunity, I only saw a wall. And when you see the wall every day, then you don't see the bright sun, you don't see the smiles of others, you just look at them. And what she taught me was, in fact, that this narrative existed. That for so many people, you beat yourself up. And it was a revelation to me. I had absolutely no insight to the reality that that narrative was not me. So she made me understand this. And for the first time, I began to see possibilities. And then what she did was she said, you know, this is like a radio station. You can change the channel. And she taught me how to change the channel. And nowadays we know that this channel changing is self-compassion. And this is the work of Kristen Neff, where we can learn to be kind to ourselves, to be gentle with ourselves, to give ourselves affirmations, to love ourselves. This isn't to say that we're perfect. It does mean to say that we don't have a dark side, but it means that we're worth being loved, that we're worth being cherished, that we're worth being embraced, even with all of our failings. And every human being is worth that. You know, you think about in the United States, we have the highest incarceration level for population. Do you really think that most of those people are there because they're evil? Do you know why most of those people are there? Because they didn't have love. They didn't have nurture. That's why people suffer. That's why people can't be their best selves. So she allowed me, or I allowed myself, to set myself free from that prison by changing that narrative. She gave me the key to do that. And it changed everything. The third thing that she taught me, and this is actually, and I talk about this in the book, she taught me to open my heart, to understand that others are suffering. Because what happens to some of us is we feel our own pain and our own suffering, and we go inward. And we think that our pain is the only pain that's out there. And then what comes from that is rumination, where you sit there and always saying, gosh, this is horrible. My life is horrible, if only, etc., etc. But the reality is that when you understand, though, that everyone is struggling, everyone is having their own difficulties, that everyone is having pain, and that this inward movement when you feel you have pain, actually worsens the pain oftentimes. It's when you actually open yourself up, have this recognition that others are suffering just like you, and open your heart to them, that then you can find that your own suffering diminishes. And in fact, you then replace it with joy. And this comes back to what I initially talked about, connection and being present. Because what do we know for sure? You know, I say that I'm an atheist in my book, and I've got some interesting emails from people. And I think they misunderstood, or perhaps I wasn't clear enough. Because if you look at the endorsements from my book, there's the Dalai Lama there, there's Thich Nhat Hanh, there's Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, there's Amma, there's Eckhart Tolle. So if I was that much of a schmuck, I probably wouldn't be there. But what I meant by that was that you don't necessarily have to follow anyone, because the truth is within you. You just have to be present with it. And what is that truth? It's a truth that you're a remarkable, incredible human being, and that you're worth being loved. It's a truth that we're all connected. It's a truth that each of us wants the same thing. And it's a truth that when you really care, when you open your heart, when you're really present with somebody, it is the greatest joy that you'll ever experience. But you have to get there, and you have to not be afraid. And that's the challenge. So what she did was, she taught me this lesson. But at 12, I wasn't ready for that lesson, at least in part. And then the last thing that she taught me, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The last thing that she taught me was this idea of visualization and having the correct intention. And that's what allowed me to be here with you today. Because what happens for many of us, we come up with an idea or a plan, but we don't really see it. In fact, it's like we're wearing glasses that are opaque. And we sort of stumble around and we're trying to get there, but we never get there oftentimes. And what she did was to teach me that with intention, with repetition, what happens is that the glasses start to clear. And you start seeing much, much more clearly where you're going. And as you see clearer and clearer, what you wished, what you desired, becomes available to you. Now, I'm not saying in every instance, and I'm not saying that if you wanted to fly to the moon tomorrow, you will do so. But what I will tell you that more likely than not, if your intention is clear and pure, if you visualize this over and over, it is much more likely than not that it will happen. Now, people say to me, and actually I think David White was talking about this, he said, you know, we want it to be like a desert, a flat road, a straight line, and wow, that's great, I'm there, it all happened, fantastic. But that's not how it works. You have detours, you have hills and valleys, and the interesting thing about those detours and those hills and valleys is actually, believe it or not, that can be the best part of the journey. You know, so often we have attachment to feeling good. I accomplished this, I did that, I got this award for this, people think I'm a great guy. Yet, so often it's transitory. But what sticks with you, what you remember, is when you did have a detour, a stop, and one that caused you pain or suffering, that allowed you to reflect, that allowed you to see. And it is those experiences, actually, that give us the greatest wisdom and allows us actually to have the tools that allow us ultimately to be our best selves, to see the true nature of reality, to see that the events that are occurring oftentimes, and even how others act towards us, it's not about them. It's not about that they're doing something or the world is conspiring against us. It's actually about how we respond to those events. See, this is what people forget. It's not the event itself, it's how we respond to the event. How many of you know Viktor Frankl? So Viktor Frankl, for those who you may not know him, but I would suggest you get to know him, was a psychiatrist during the Holocaust and was in a concentration camp. And one of the things that he said was that between stimulus and response, there's a pause. Within that pause is freedom. And you see, this is what we have a tendency to forget. Our own ability to pause and choose what our response is. You see, one of the toughest things to do is to be discerning and thoughtful. Now let me give you an example. Have any of you ever been cut off by anybody in traffic? Now I know the women would never do this, but for the men they may say an expletive or use a hand gesture. But I know the women would never. And it's frustrating, right? What is the judgment you make about that person? Insensitive, doesn't care about others, rude, not a nice person, right? I mean, isn't that true, generally? And you've made a judgment, right? And in fact, you may choose to beep your horn, you may choose to speed up and cut in front of them. I don't suggest you do that. But let me change the narrative slightly. What if I told you behind the wheel of the car was the husband of the woman who's sitting next to him, who's 9 months pregnant? She's broke her water, she's bleeding. And he's trying to get her to the hospital. Now, how does that narrative in your head change? Are you still angry? And in fact, you would escort them to the hospital, wouldn't you? You would do everything you could to help them, because this woman potentially is going to die. But whether you chose to be angry or not, you didn't know the real circumstance, did you? But you made a judgment. You see, and this is a tendency we all have to do, or a tendency we all have, is to make judgments about situations or events and create a narrative around them that has nothing to do with reality. And one of the things that I've taken a long time trying to do is for myself to be more thoughtful. Because you see, again, your freedom is in that response. You see, when that person cuts me off, which narrative do I choose? And it's the same way we choose to have a positive narrative within our head or a negative narrative. I choose to always have a positive narrative. And more times than not, I'm proven correct. The other thing is, if you start with a positive narrative, it changes things. And let me tell you a little bit. I used to have an immense amount of anger and hostility towards my parents. It was their fault my life wasn't the way I wished it to be. And I used to carry this with me. But what was the reality? I never felt my parents didn't love me. The reality was that they had their own reality, that they were struggling themselves. And unfortunately, they did not have the tools to help me. It wasn't because of me. It wasn't because they didn't love me. They were just lost in their own situation, their own problems, because of their own baggage that they carried with them and were never able to deal with. So after being with this woman, I suddenly had a clear vision. I had no longer any anger towards my parents. I had no anger towards my situation. What I didn't realize was the anger that I carried with me. People can see, as a species, we are highly attuned to the emotional states of others. We can interpret microfacial expressions, body language, even smells. I mean, how many of you, if your partner walks into the room, or if your child, they don't have to say a word and you know exactly what's going on, right? And this is true. So I carried this anger, this hostility, this negative feeling everywhere I went. And I had no understanding that the reason oftentimes people reacted negatively to me was because of the energy I was putting out there, the anger. And what this woman taught me was how to release that and accept the situation, not to be angry about the situation. Because remember, situations are neither good nor bad. They're simply a situation. It's how we choose to respond to the situation that gives it a type of energy. So this is what allowed me to be here. Because what I tell people is that when I changed how I reacted to the world changed how it reacted to me. And it allowed me to go to medical school, to become a doctor, a neurosurgeon, a professor, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, apparently a writer, and it was the greatest gift that I ever had. And what people forget is that each of us has within us, regardless of our status, our station, our wealth, to be of service and to care. And sometimes it can simply be saying hello. You know, there was a young lady, and the story was told to me. She was a student at Stanford, and she was highly introverted and very angry. And the RA, or the resident assistant, he would see her every day, and she would just sit. And she never said hello once. Once. And she always had a scowl on her face. And every day, he made sure he walked by her and he said hello. Every day, 3 months. At the end of this 3 months, he walked by and he said hello. And she looked at him, she said hello, and she started crying. Because she had built up this wall. Because she was so angry at the world and she felt so separated, she felt that nobody understood her. And this wall had become so thick and so heavy that it was almost impossible for anyone to break through it. But he broke through it. I'll tell you another story. There's a particular Starbucks I go to, and there's this wonderful young lady who always had a smile on her face. She would always serve me, and I would have brief conversations with her. And one day I went in there, and my son was 10 at the time. And we started talking, and she asked my son how old he was and his name. And she said, I have a daughter. She's 9. And we started talking. I said, that's wonderful. Well, I went in another day, and I said, wow, you know, how is it that you're here working? And she said, well, I was in college, and I got pregnant. And I didn't want to have an abortion. And I dropped out of college, but I wanted to be a doctor. And she said, you know, I've been working here a long time, and I finally finished my degree, and I didn't do as well as I wanted, but I had to work, etc. And she said, but I'm really trying now, but I've been rejected for the last 3 years. I said, well, you know, that's interesting. Why don't you show me your stuff? And I'd like to see it, maybe I can help you. So I looked over her stuff, and you know, if she was from an affluent background, she would have had people who would have helped her. They would have helped with her essay. They might have written her essay for her. Have you ever heard of helicopter sharing? But she had none of that. And so I sat with her, And I reorganized some things for her, gave her some ideas, made some phone calls, and she finished medical school. She's so, I will say that, listen, it was a blessing for me to have the opportunity to help her. But my point is, it took probably 2 or 3 hours of my time, but it fundamentally changed her life. And each of us, we oftentimes think, I'm not known, I'm not powerful. You are incredibly powerful. And as an example, that girl, her flame was barely there. But once she blossomed, once she had this happen, you could see this radiance about her. And each of us have the ability to give that gift to ourselves, and each of us has the ability to give that gift to another. I'm going to tell you another quick story, and this was in the book. And when it came time to apply to medical school. Let me actually even back up even further. I had no idea what it took to apply to college. None. And here's how I applied to college. I was in a science class, and I always sat next to this pretty girl, hoping that I would get to know her. But one day she was filling out an application. And I looked over and I saw this, and I asked her what she was doing. And she said, well, I'm applying to college. And I had not even known it was time to apply to college. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, it's due Friday. And this was like, I'm going, oh my God. And I said, well, where are you going? Or where are you applying? She said, I'm applying to UC Irvine. And she looked at me and said, where are you going? I go, UC Irvine. And she said, well, I have an extra application. And I applied to one college. And that's where I went. So I went to UC Irvine, and it was time to apply to medical school. And I did not realize that to apply to medical school at that time, you needed a letter of recommendation from a pre-med committee. And you had to go and be interviewed. And the average grade point average at that time when I applied to medical school was 3.79. Okay. Now remember, I had to leave school for long periods of time. I had to deal with getting my father out of jail and all sorts of horrible situations. When I applied to medical school, my GPA was 2.53. So I went to the office where you asked for this interview, and the lady looked at me and she said, I'm not going to give you an interview. I said, why? Because it's a waste of everyone's time. So just as you can reach out and change a life in a positive way, you can also potentially change a life by your words. So I looked at her and I said, well, you know what, I appreciate your opinion, not my opinion. And I said, I'm not leaving here until you give me an appointment. And I said, if you want to call security, that's fine, but I am not leaving here. So she reluctantly gave me the appointment. So I go to this room at the appointed time. There are 3 people sitting there and it's one of these rectangular tables. There are 3 people sitting there like this. And you even know what the body language of that is. And then I'm at the other end by myself. And the guy who's in the center, he picks up my file and he says, listen, you got your appointment, tell us what you need to know. You're never going to get into medical school. So, but you had your day. So I looked at him and I said, who gave you the right to destroy people's dreams? And then I proceeded to lecture him for 45 minutes. Because there's not one shred of evidence that beyond a above average degree of intelligence, that you cannot succeed. And in fact, if you look at, there was a study done of all the valedictorian and salutatorians, okay? And while all of them did well professionally, not a one did anything to change the world. Because they played a game. They stayed within the boundaries. Okay? And listen, I'm not telling you not to strive for this, because I'm going to have the helicopter parent go, you but my point here is that people who change the world take unconventional paths. People who change the world don't listen oftentimes. People who change the world have a vision and an intention. So anyway, at the end of this conversation, they were all crying. Because I forced them to look at me not as a number, but as a human being. And when somebody forces you to see them as a human being, you cannot turn away. You cannot write them off. Because their humanity has been shown to you. And the very nature of who we are is when we see someone suffering, when someone shows us their true selves, we cannot help but embrace them. So they ended up writing me the highest letter of recommendation. Yeah. Now the rest of the story goes as follows. And then I probably should shut up, right? Because we're running. Okay. So as I'm walking out of this room, the secretary, and the door was open a crack, she heard all of this. She said, I have something for you. And she handed me a brochure. It was a green trifold brochure that I remember this very clearly. And I said, what's this? And she said, well, it's an application to a summer enrichment program for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds and for minority students. And she said, but I have to tell you, the deadline has passed, but I don't think it'll be a problem. So, I called this woman. She let me into this program. I applied to one medical school, and I graduated from Tulane, which is in New Orleans, okay? Now let's fast forward. So I was and I actually never got a degree, or I did not initially get a degree from UC Irvine. I left without a degree and a 2.53 to medical school. Okay. And that's probably still a record. But fast forward, after Hurricane Katrina, the library was severely damaged, the medical school shut down, they moved to Houston, the dean resigned because he actually went into a deep depression, and they were searching for a new dean. And this was a guy from Harvard, and he wanted an endowed chair. I don't know if you all know what an endowed chair is, but you have to commit a large sum of money, and that chair carries that person's name. And it's a very high honor in academics. So I ended up actually refurbishing the library, endowing the chair, and I'm now on the board of governors, and I'm the largest donor to Tulane Medical School. Okay? Now I don't tell that to congratulate myself, but my point is, none of us has the ability to determine the future of another human being. Each of you has that within you to open the gate of your own prison, let yourself out to see the sunlight, and be your best self. Thank you.